Well, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to cover two topics: extended producer responsibility, otherwise what I call Walter's world. And we're also going to discuss local greenhouse gas inventory summaries. We are glad and proud to share the terrific progress our partners have made on these issues, and our communities have been keenly interested in both these topics, as all of you know. First, it's an honor to introduce and welcome a good friend of mine, a good friend of the committees, a good friend of the Climate Action Plan, our senior planner from CMAP, Jared Patton. Jared was an invaluable member of the Climate Action Plan team, and we are, again, honored that he's with us this morning. As we work together with other regions to create our regional CAP, we learned that the metropolitan planning organizations can present greenhouse gas data in ways that can support local municipal scale climate action. Jared took the idea of community GHG summaries and ran with it. Today, he will tell us about his innovation and explain how this new CMAP accomplishment will help all of us achieve the goal of the Climate Action Plan. Jared is a city planner with expertise in climate resilience, land use planning, and environmental policy. Jared develops local and regional solutions for addressing environmental, social, and economic challenges. He hails from Dayton, Ohio, the home of the Flyers, and just this past spring, he conquered, allegedly, the boundary waters. That had been pretty cool, huh?
I don't know if conquered means the same thing as barely managed to make it out. But
see, I was going to ask that, yes. Conquered or survived, one of the two.
Yeah, so. I think the latter.
Well, we're delighted you're here, man. And the floor is yours, Jared. Thank you.
All right, great. Thanks so much for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Great.
And I'm not going to start presenting until it is shared because I do not have that much confidence in this. Is it working?
Yes.
Are we there? Wonderful. Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for that introduction, Mayor Burns. I'm really excited to be here this morning, so thanks for having me. And I'm particularly excited to be talking about this work, the regional greenhouse gas emissions inventory and the local emissions summaries, because I think it's something that's not only important and interesting, but also potentially really valuable for all of your work. And whenever I can provide something that makes someone's job easier, makes them more effective, well, that's a good day for me. And I think that's something that this project can do. I should mention that I am going to be talking about the local emission summaries. I'm also going to be talking about the regional results, and that's what I'm going to start with here. So with that, I'll get right into it, and I'll begin with a quick overview of why we're doing this work. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with On to 2050. That's our comprehensive regional plan. And that plan sets the goal of intensifying climate mitigation efforts. And specifically, we have a target of reducing the region's greenhouse gas emissions by 80% relative to 2005 levels by 2050. And I should say that is our minimum target. Hopefully we can exceed that. Now, if we have a target, we need to be measuring our progress towards the target, which is where the emissions inventory comes in. This project is the third time that we have conducted a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. We've done one every 5 years, going back to 2010, though I want to emphasize that this inventory is not for 2020 as we initially planned, but for 2019 instead. And that's for all the reasons that you can probably guess. 2020 was a really strange year, especially when you're looking at things like transportation trends and energy consumption. And we wanted to make sure that the data we were putting together would be representative of the region as a whole and something that we can look back and use for planning purposes moving forward. So all the data that you'll be seeing today show where the region was just before the effects of the pandemic began to be felt. And the next update, which will be in no later than 2025, possibly sooner, that's when we'll catch those pandemic and hopefully post-pandemic trends. So this slide really gets into what is included in the inventory, and this is intended to be a truly comprehensive assessment of all of the emissions in the region, and we generally group them into three buckets, or what we call sectors. The first is transportation. The second is stationary energy, which really means all emissions coming from buildings, mostly from electricity or on-site use of natural gas for things like heating and cooking. And then finally, waste and wastewater. We conduct these full inventories for all 7 counties, as well as the city of Chicago, and we pull out suburban Cook County as a separate jurisdiction. That's what we've done in past inventories. And then this time around, we also are creating what we call local emissions summaries for every municipality and every Chicago community area. I'll be talking a bit more about those at the end of the presentation, but I do want to tease it a little bit now because it's what I think will be really helpful for your work and something that I'm really excited about. So without further ado, let's get into the results. The big banner headline here is 112 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent that the region emitted in 2019. And I want to pause and say, if that doesn't mean anything to you, don't panic. I don't think many people know what an MM2 CO2 is, but it is valuable to track because it allows us to see how we are doing over time. And that number represents a 9% reduction in emissions since 2010 and a 2% reduction since 2015. And it's a positive thing that we are reducing emissions, but we are not seeing reductions to the scale that we need to achieve our target. In order to see an 80% reduction in emissions, we need to be achieving a 5% annual reduction in emissions. And if we want to go further to something closer to near zero or net zero, that number is a 10% annual reduction. So we're headed in the right direction, but we do need to pick up the pace. The chart on the right side of your screen breaks things down by those sectors that I highlighted. We see here that stationary energy is our largest sector, our biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, that's 65%. The second largest is transportation, which is almost a third of our emissions. And then finally, waste and wastewater is just 3%. So I'm now going to break down these sectors a little bit more so you can hopefully get a better idea of what's happening here. And I want to start with stationary energy, which again, this is our biggest sector. It's 65% of all emissions. And if you look at the pie chart on the right, you can see what that breakdown looks like. 44% of all emissions from buildings come from commercial and industrial buildings, followed by residential buildings. And I think that's a potentially interesting fact because while commercial and industrial buildings are producing slightly more emissions, we have many more residential buildings. So that might be an opportunity to have a little bit more bang for your buck on some of your investments for reducing emissions. But the real thing I want to highlight in this sector is on the left side of the screen. Stationary energy is the place where we've really seen the most reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, an 11% reduction since 2010. That is the lion's share of the emissions reductions the region has experienced. And almost all of those, I believe all of those reductions are from the electricity sector. We've done a really good job of cleaning our electricity grid. We've been transitioning away from more carbon intensive sources like coal towards more sustainable options like wind, solar, and also natural gas. And the next chart here does a good job of highlighting what that progress has looked like. So from 2010 to 2019, consumption of both electricity and natural gas increased, but because electricity is increasingly cleaner and cleaner, the emissions from electricity have decreased. And so you see here that in 2010, electricity produced significantly more emissions than natural gas, but that has decreased in each of our last two inventories. And in 2019, we really nearly saw parity between electricity and natural gas emissions. I expect that the next update will see electricity generating fewer emissions than natural gas, and that's a noteworthy trend. Moving on to the second sector here, transportation. This represents 32% of all of our emissions. Again, that's roughly a third. And we see that the vast majority of transportation emissions come from what we call on-road sources. Those are public and private cars, buses, and trucks, really anything that's designed to be driven on a road. The second biggest source of emissions in this sector are what we call off-road, which isn't immediately intuitive. It does include all-terrain vehicles, which is what people's mind tends to go to, but most of these emissions are from construction equipment. So things used to build roads, build buildings, forklifts, also lawn maintenance vehicles, really anything that moves that's not a vehicle designed to be driven on a road. Aviation represents 5% of the region's emissions, and this is an exciting thing to include here because unlike our past inventories, this does include takeoffs and landings from O'Hare and Midway airports. Railways represent just 2% of the sector. They are pretty clean, and then waterborne navigation is less than 1%. So similar to stationary energy, the real headline here is how this has changed over the last 9 years. And this is the one area where we are not seeing progress. We've seen a 2% increase in emissions between 2010 and 2019, and that's mostly due to driving. both on a per person and an absolute basis. The technical term would be an increase in vehicle miles traveled overall and per capita. And I really want to highlight that this is before the pandemic. And since the pandemic, we've seen a pretty significant drop in transit ridership. So we can assume that if this was already happening in 2019, we're seeing it even more so today. And this is particularly concerning for us here at CMAP because we are first and foremost a transportation agency. Finally, the third sector is waste. This is 3% of all of our emissions. Looking again at the pie chart on the right, we can see that 3/4 of our emissions, rather, 75% here, come from landfills. That's shown in green. The next biggest sector or subsector here is wastewater, followed by composting, which is a pretty small but important piece of the pie. This is a sector where we have seen tremendous improvement. In our last 2 inventories, both saw a considerable reduction in waste and wastewater emissions. That's due to a variety of reasons. Some are listed here. Methane capture is now pretty ubiquitous. Wastewater plant improvements, we're seeing more anaerobic digesters and methane capture there, and also an increase in composting. So the last 3 slides showed where we were at the regional scale, but we are providing this information at the county level, and that's what this chart is showing. So looking at the bars here, you can see absolute emissions, how much emissions each county is producing. And when you break things down this way, you can see that suburban Cook County is the largest, excluding the city of Chicago, is the largest generator of greenhouse gas emissions, followed by the city of Chicago, and then Will and DuPage County. But it gets really interesting when you look at things per capita. And when you do it that way, you see the city of Chicago, Cook, Kendall, McHenry, you see a lot of people doing really well. And then the big outlier is Will County, which produces the most emissions on a per capita basis. And that's something that we saw in our last 2 inventories as well. So in a moment, I'm going to pause and ask if there are any questions about this information before moving on to the local summaries. But first, I do want to highlight a few of these key takeaways that I want to make sure that sink in for everyone. And the first is that we saw a 9% reduction since 2010. So we are reducing our emissions, but it really is not enough to reach CMAP's 80% target, and certainly not enough to achieve a net zero or a near zero target. Largely, that's because transportation emissions are still increasing. That's not a great trend and one that we would like to see reversed. And then also natural gas emissions are relatively flat. So in the building sector, we're seeing great improvements in electricity emissions, but natural gas emissions are staying relatively where they've been for the last 9 years. And with that, I'm going to pause for a second and see if anyone has any questions or would like a little more information about any of these topics.
Yeah, any questions or comments, just either raise your hand or chime in. Edith and Cheryl are going to help me monitor. Jared, great presentation. I'm looking forward to sharing that with a lot of people, particularly the graph that shows where the energy comes from. So
Great, thank you.
So I'm monitoring the chat here. This is Edith. We've got a question from Craig Schneider. Is lawn equipment included in the off-road emissions category?
It is, yes. It's included in the models that are used to get that number.
Okay. And we have a question about the availability of slides. We always post these, but Jared will, and they'll be on the Environment Committee webpage at the end, but Jared will talk to you about when all of this data will be available. So that's
Right.
to Elizabeth. Elizabeth questions. Natalie, do you mind just asking your question rather than having me read it, Natalie Grimaldi?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, all right, great. Well, I submit the reporting for Highland Park for their yearly greenhouse gas emissions, and then submission to CDP, which is a typical framework for many municipalities. So there were some sections that related to CMAP's work regarding like rideshare. Like what's the rideshare components throughout Highland Park or any city really who's doing the reporting? So just like kind of in general, like how does your work support and relate to an individual city's yearly reporting requirements? And like what additional data that you do would benefit every municipality or city as well?
Great, thank you. So that would be a great segue to the second section, which is all about some of that local level data. So I'm going to hold off on answering that, and then hopefully what I'm about to speak about will get to that point. but I don't want to move on from this until everyone has a chance to ask questions. But I appreciate that. And if I don't answer your question, please ask again and I'll try to answer it.
I think
Yeah,
Natalie's
definitely. It's kind
question-
of it's kind of a general question, and in general, you know, if anything is related to that, if you could point it out.
I think your question, Natalie, is on the top of probably everyone's mind as well. So great question.
Jared, we have a question from Liz Kunkel, and I had the same question, although I know some of the answer. Why is Will County's per capita emissions rate so much higher than every other county?
Yeah, so
Now,
that's something
hold on,
that,
before you answer that question, Jared, I think everyone should know this, don't you think? Why is that? I think I know.
Marta Keen is offering an answer or a speculation.
Okay,
answer.
Marta, give it a shot. Will County is the largest inland port in North America.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute and I'm just, yes, that's my speculation.
Yes, mine too.
Jared, what do you say?
so that is certainly a part of the answer, but
Ah,
when we break it
shucks.
down at the subsector, we do see Will
Okay.
County being higher in almost every category. So it's higher in transportation, it's also higher in building emissions for natural gas and
Oh.
electricity. So there are many factors at play here. Before I give a definitive answer, I'd want to dig into that information a little bit more, which is really at the phase that we're almost to in this project. So we spent the last year putting together these calculations, and then the next step is, once we publish this, is really to dig into them a little bit more. And that's something that is going to be different about this release of the data than in the past. We are going to be making all of our calculations public, both at the regional level, so the information I've covered, as well as the more detailed local level data. And the hope is that, we will be able to continue digging into that and seeing if we can identify any trends or any causalities, but also people who are not CMAP can dig into that, because we know that there are many universities, many community groups, and others who have resources that we don't have. And we want to make sure that people are looking at this information, because there are conclusions that we probably don't have the ability to draw from them that others might be able to.
Yeah, Liz and I were on the same page there, but clearly our answer is only partially accurate. So that's really interesting stuff.
Jared, we have a question from Tessa in Northbrook. And Tessa, it's about our favorite topic, the emissions factor. Tessa, if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question. We'll take it.
Yes, I was just wondering how the overall regional power grid and the greening of that grid translates to a reduced emissions factor in electricity, if CMAP keeps an eye on that during their inventories.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the things that we changed this time around for the inventory was that we decided to not use the eGrid emissions factor that we'd used in the past. For those of you who are not familiar with it can get a little jargony. The way that you calculate emissions from electricity in particular is that you get usage data from the utilities that say how much each community is using in kilowatt hours. And then you times that by an emissions factor, which is an estimate that says per kilowatt hour, this much greenhouse gas equivalent or CO2 equivalent is being produced. The way that most people do these calculations is that they will use what's called eGrid, which is an estimate created by, I believe, the Department of Energy, but it's a federal calculation that breaks down the country into a series of regions. Our region includes not just Northeastern Illinois, but also Indiana, I believe Ohio, and West Virginia or Kentucky, one of those, but not both. But it's a much larger area that frankly uses a lot more coal and a lot less nuclear energy than we do here in the region. So when we did these calculations, we worked with ComEd to create a local emissions factor that uses just the electricity being generated in the region. And we were a little hesitant to do that, but we worked with consultants to make sure that it was the right decision. Ultimately, we decided it was, in part because the region is likely a net exporter of electricity, so we can be reasonably sure that most of the electricity being generated or consumed here is also generated here. We did pull out communities that have their own municipal generation facilities, so they are not grouped into that because most of the local generation is not going to be nuclear energy, which is fairly clean. But yeah, maybe I answered that. I got a little rambly there, but yeah, it's something we thought about quite a bit.
You did, yes, thank you.
And I guess it's also worth noting that when we did this update, we also updated the 2010 and 2015 numbers as well to make sure that we are getting that apples to apples comparison. So they use the same methodology.
So I think with that, Jared, those are most of the questions
Yeah.
about the regional inventory. So lots of questions and people really anticipating what's going on at the community scale. So if you want to pivot back to that, that would be great.
Great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Jared,
So
your new nickname is now Jared Little Rambly Patton. So please continue. So
hey, I'll take it. I'll take it. Okay, so local emissions summaries. I've already kind of previewed this a little bit, but here's a little bit more background. These really are seen as a companion to the regional inventory, but they are not exactly the same thing, and they're not totally a part of it. So if you were to add together all of the inventories for a county, you wouldn't necessarily get the county total that we have in the inventories. That's because a lot of the data sets are different. Some of the data sets that we use for the county inventories aren't available at the local level. So it is a companion. It does not include everything in the inventory. These are not full inventories, so you won't be able to just plug this into your CDP site and get the total that you need. But for most communities, this should be enough, and that was really our target. What we heard from past inventories was that the county level data is important. It's great if you work for the county. It's helpful, but if you work for a local government, it can be more of a fun fact than anything, because it's sort of hard to see how your work translates into a county with 1 million or 5 million people. So when we were doing this work, we saw that many of the biggest sources of emissions can be pretty easily broken down at the local level. So we decided we would try to provide as much of that information as possible. So while it doesn't include everything that an inventory does provide, we were also able to include some things that an inventory does not include, which is some context about why emissions are where they are today. So for each of these reports, we both provide some emissions estimates, and then we also break down each sector. So we show, for example, for transportation, we show how people are getting to work. You know, are people driving alone? Are they taking transit? Are they walking? We show how many vehicles per household are owned in that community, how many EV registrations there are, things of that nature. So the idea is to provide most of the information that a community will need to get started doing some climate planning. And with that, here's the big reveal. This is what they will look like. This is an example. This is for Gurney, obviously, and I can walk you through briefly what we're seeing here. So this is a 2-page document. It's, you know, maybe not the most beautiful thing, but it is intended to be designed enough to be pretty easy to use, be a little user-friendly, and provide the information that you need. So it starts with the blurb at the top. That's just a quick summary of what this document is seeking to accomplish. And then next to that, we have some community characteristics to provide context that lists things like population and jobs, but also things like tree canopy coverage, impervious surfaces, and whether or not the community is a member of the Greenest Region Compact. Those are just sort of your table dressing that outlines the broader picture of the community. Then we get into the emissions themselves, and we don't present emissions as a pie chart showing the percentage in the entire community, because we know that these are not inclusive of all emissions. What we're really able to show here is electricity emissions, natural gas emissions, on-road transportation, and then a proxy for waste that's based off of the population of the community relative to the county. So that's more of a county level figure that's broken down so you can see what share is from waste likely. And then we don't just provide those totals, we also have a comparison to the county or the city of Chicago for community areas. So you can see how your community relates to the larger community. And if something is a big outlier there, that might be somewhere to pay a little bit more attention. The second page gets into a little bit more detail about why those emissions might be at the level they are. So for energy consumption, we have those raw energy levels. We have some information about solar capacity and some comparisons to the county and the region as a whole. On the bottom of the page here, we have transportation, which admittedly has a little bit more information. And I already spoke to some of this. We have vehicle registrations, electric vehicles, we have electric vehicle chargers, mode share, things of that nature. And I do want to emphasize here that this data is for 2019 as well. So for some of the things, especially on the transportation side, we know that things have changed considerably, but we did want to keep it consistent. So that's what it will look like. And then finally, I have a few notes about how to use the summaries. And the first way you can use this is as a communications tool. This is a great way to start a conversation with elected officials, with residents, with village staff, to just have a basis for your conversation when you're discussing climate. The second way you can use this is to prioritize climate actions. If you have a local climate action plan, perfect. You can put it side by side with the summary and see where you can get the biggest bang for your buck on some of these actions. If you don't have a local climate action plan, I really want to plug the Mayor's Caucus's climate action plan. It's a really great tool, and in many ways, these are approaching the topic in the same way. You know, both projects seek to help a local government get started and to save that first step of creating an inventory or creating a climate action plan. There's some communities that will definitely still want to do that, but if you don't have the resources to do that, we still want you to be able to get started. Third, you can and should reference the summary if you're applying for a grant. So if you're trying to get money for bicycle or pedestrian infrastructure and you see in your summary that transportation emissions are a pretty big chunk of your emissions, then you can reference that and it'll strengthen your argument, hopefully. And then finally, track progress. And here I have a really big asterisk because we haven't yet released this data the first time. So I can't promise that there will be an update, but I hope there will be. And if after you get your hands on this, you see it as having a lot of value, as being helpful for your work, please let us know and it will be more likely to be updated, and then you can see how you're doing over time. And then that leaves me with my last big slide here, which is kind of a bummer to end on. The publication details. When we scheduled this presentation, we hoped it would be released. It has not yet been released, but it should be soon. It should be very soon. Hopefully in the next 1 to 2 weeks, you'll be able to get your hands on all of this information. That will include a summary report, which is what you see on the right side of your screen. That's not the 100-page report we've released in the past. It's a quick 15-page summary that highlights most of the things that I discussed, but in a little bit more detail. We'll also be releasing emission summaries for every municipality, every community area, and all 7 counties. We'll be releasing all of the data, so just some pretty massive Excel spreadsheets that you can dig into. And then our methodology report, so you can check our work. With that, here's my contact information, and I'm including this both because I'm always happy to answer questions, but also because over the next few months, we're going to be doing a bit of a roadshow to try to get this in front of as many people as possible. This is something that we think could be really valuable, but only if people know that it exists. So if you would like me to speak with your village board, with staff, with a group of local residents, let me know. I'd be happy to do it myself or find someone else at CMAP to make that happen. Before I hand it over, I do have one point that I want to highlight, which was not part of my presentation, which I can imagine will be a question and was sort of already asked. These inventories are done at the scale of the entire region. So there are many things that are likely missing that a local government or a local group will probably have access to that we do not. So if you do already have a local emissions inventory, we see this as being secondary to that. So the idea here isn't to correct the work that other communities are doing. So if that's a concern, please don't be. We say in our materials as we release it, that this really is secondary to any local calculations. And with that, I will stop and see if there are any other questions either now or reach out to me after.
Jared, before we ask for other questions, I've got a quick question for you that I'm certain you probably heard or will hear, and perhaps others are thinking the same. This data that you are soon to release based on the region is 2019 data, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
When the question's asked, well, if it's 2019 data and now it's 2022, is there a factor or a percentage you can estimate that would bring it up to speed, or is that just a question you can't answer? Up to more current, if you will.
Yeah, I would be hesitant to do that
Okay.
because there are just so many factors that affect these numbers. I would say that it's not as out of date as it seems, because
Okay.
you obviously have to wait for 2019 to be over to get started, and then it takes about a year to do the work. So it's a year further in the past than what
Okay.
we were shooting for, but it's been a really weird year, and in many ways, some of these trends still haven't stabilized. So
Okay. I think it's extraordinary work. Thank you so much. And we will sign up Geneva to have a presentation. Absolutely. We will send a limo to you, an electric limo, of course. We will have you out.
can't wait, can't wait. And I should say that while this information hasn't been published, it's not top secret or anything like that. So if you are interested in seeing information for your community, let me know and I can make that happen on a case-by-case basis.
Anyone else? Sharon? Edith?
So Jared, there's just a lot of enthusiasm for these, and I have to share that. This is something that I watched the idea grow and that you really ran with it. So thank you for that. So everyone seems to be looking forward to it. There aren't specific questions on the local snapshots, except let me add it. There is one question from Sydney about whether the emissions from trucking and hauling of waste for both recycling and landfill are counted in transportation or waste, which is a good question.
Very
My
good
understanding is that those go into the on-road bucket, which is imperfect, but that's how we estimate vehicles. And if that's, I'll check when I stop talking, and if it's wrong, I'll let you know in the chat.
Great, thank you. I think that's it. One thing that I put in the chat, but just to point out that the connection between the climate action plan, both at the regional level and local levels, is to take the regional greenhouse gas inventory as the baseline for the climate mitigation section, and then project and model how can we reduce those.
Right.
So that's what the climate action plan is about. And Walter, to your question, I just pasted in the chat the climate action plan for the region, and there are wedge charts for each of the objectives related to climate to climate mitigation that looks at the bucket and objective related to that. Jared talked a lot about reduced vehicle miles traveled, something that we're working on with MPC and ATA. And the one that you asked about is related to electric vehicles. So we modeled that, and CMAP helped us tremendously with it using the baseline 2015 emissions. So picture of that chat, or a picture of that can be found in the climate action plan following that link. And then great suggestions here from Beth Drucker going on in the chat. So Brett, do you want to ask your question, I think, and then we'll switch to the next speaker. Brent, sorry.
No, I was just volunteering
There you are.
our assistance in terms of industrial manufacturing energy efficiency.
Oh, good. Thank you.
And sneak in one more. There's a couple more in there. I guess, should we pivot here?
It's up to you. I'll defer to you.
Jared, you want to look at those questions in the chat and see if you want to take them? Or...
Sure. So I can just see this last one here about CMAP's targets for transportation emissions. And I should say this is something that we are very aware that we need. And we are currently working on a project to develop a transportation mitigation plan that's specific to CMAP's work. So I don't have much information to share on that currently, but it's not because we're not working on it. Instead, it's because we are just starting to work on it in a very serious way.
And then last question on this section, we'll just take Marta's. And Marta, if you wanted to read your question. It relates to, unless you're having trouble unmuting, it's how do corporate net zero efforts impact when trucks haul their materials? I don't fully understand the question.
So corporations are really, a lot of them anyway, not all of them, are coming along trying to create net zero. They talk about it at their buildings sometimes, but if they're producing a product and it's getting shipped all over the place to stores and to homes through Amazon and what have you, how does that equate to your plan? Because a corporation might say that they're at net zero, but your plan's still going to show emissions.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is the answer there. If you're not accounting for all of it, then you're not really at net zero. I should highlight that many organizations include carbon offsets, so sequestration, things like reforestation efforts to give them a little bit of a credit on the emissions that they're still generating. And that is not something that we include in this inventory. So we're not trying to hit that net measurement at all. So we're not. That's something that could be going into the calculations for a corporation.
I won't go down that rabbit hole.
We won't either, clearly.
With that, I think we should pivot to the next speaker.
Fair enough. We're going to talk about EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility, and specifically legislation for paper and packaging products. Walter Willis, the Executive Director of the Solid Waste Agency of Lake County, otherwise known as SWALCO, and Sydney Harris, Policy and Program Manager, Product Stewardship Institute. Walter, take it away, sir.
Thank you, Mayor. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Wanted to give a brief presentation, and Sydney will go through the more nuts and bolts of the piece of legislation. But in big picture, what are we talking about here? The big thing we're talking about is extended producer responsibility, as the mayor pointed out. Really, what we're doing is we're shifting the cost and the responsibility for the products and the packaging that various manufacturers put into the marketplace. We're shifting it into their balance sheet instead of a cost to the consumer or the government. And that brings about a lot of change. It brings about design for the environment, design for recyclability. So we've got a couple strong examples. The electronics bill we passed many years ago it's supported by the electronics manufacturers. Soon we'll have a drug take back program that's supported by the pharmaceutical companies. So what we're doing here with the packaging is trying to create a stronger circular economy for recycling. Illinois has got a lot of areas of the country or the state that don't have access to recycling. This legislation would change that. Access would be statewide for single family, multifamily, local government, public and private schools, and public space. We'd have access to recycling either curbside for single family or drop off for the single family and multifamily. Significant goals. We're probably at about 20% in Illinois. We will try to double that by 2030 and get to 50% by 2035. Reasonable but significant increases, getting to that 3% cohort that Jared was talking about, that waste contributes to greenhouse gases. Every little bit helps. We would also have recycled content requirements so that we would create markets for the materials that if we're going to divert more, we need stronger markets. This bill addresses that. It would be run by the brand owners, the companies that are putting the packaging into the marketplace, and with the input of an advisory committee that Sydney will go over. But this is a big paradigm shift. This would get everybody from the residential and the public side access to recycling and significantly increase the recycling here in the state. So I'll turn it over to Sydney. One thing I did want to point out, the key funders for this effort so far are my agency, the Solid Waste Agency in Northern Cook County, DuPage County, and the city of Chicago. We hope to have a bill ready to file next session. And we're working towards that, as Sydney will describe to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Walter. And everyone can see the slides, right?
Sure can. Thank you, Sydney.
Fantastic. Hello,
And Sydney,
everyone.
share, for those who don't know, share with everybody where you are joining us from.
Sure. Yeah, I'm joining you from my home in Portland, Maine. So thanks for letting me remote in. Probably the only non-Illinois resident here, but I have been many times. And I love it.
Yes, you have. So we're delighted to always have you and Walter with us. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So Walter already mentioned some of this. So a few of these slides, I'm going to kind of zoom through just in the interest of time. The core team here is a key part of PSI's process for, assisting in bill development for EPR. It's really just the folks whose logos are at the top of the slide here, as Walter already went through. And we thank all of those folks for contributing funding to support this project, as well as leadership and direction. And then as part of PSI's, process, as I mentioned, that we always go through, we assemble that core team, and then we use the core team to help identify members of a committee. Some of you are on this committee, so you're familiar with this. We assemble a multi-stakeholder committee. You can see folks here on the screen. I'm not going to read everybody's names. The committee helps us walk through PSI's policy model and develop really key components of the bill. So here's our timeline of what we've done. Some of you will have seen this before a few months ago when we first presented to you, but I want to recap our timeline because we've moved along. So, this process started about a year ago. We kicked off things with that core team last October, and we said, all right, we're going to work on a packaging EPR bill. Let's go. We first developed a project summary and baseline just to make sure everyone was on the same page about what problems we're trying to solve in the first place and, our goals and how we want to get there. I'm happy to share that if you don't already have that project summary. I think you may have received it in the past. And then, as I mentioned, we launch a committee. So those are the names on the previous slide. And we walk through our policy model with that committee, which is what we did in the earlier part of this year with these facilitated elements discussions. And eventually we drafted a bill. So after we got through PSI's full policy model, there are 16 key components or elements of EPR that we walk through. We turn that into a bill. We put it in a magic machine, comes out as a bill, AKA my computer. And then now we're kind of here in the sort of the tail end of our process for stakeholder engagement, and we've reconvened the committee. We've had many meetings outside the committee with additional key stakeholders and gotten a ton of feedback. Now we're in the phase of taking a breath, compiling all that feedback, looking at what folks have suggested for changes to the bill so far and what their priorities are, and working with that core team again to kind of revise the draft bill and looking ahead, as Walter said, toward introduction of a bill in 2023. So that's our process. Very exciting. This is just another way to show the exact same thing. We have our core team and our committee, and now we're kind of inching our way toward a, with targeted stakeholder outreach toward a publicly available draft bill that, will be introduced. And so will be open to the general public for comment. I mentioned that our policy model has 16 key components. These are those components. We're obviously not going to walk through all of those today, but just so you have, a copy of this afterward, and you can see the tremendous amount of work that the committee went through to look in depth at every single one of these 16 elements. It was many hours of Zoom calls. I am going to highlight a few of them for you today with just a caveat that some of this, as I just mentioned, will be changing a little bit based on the feedback that we've received so far. So happy to talk about that. But for now, what's in the draft bill? First of all, what materials are we even talking about here? We're talking about consumer packaging. That's primary, secondary, and tertiary packaging and service packaging. We're talking about printed paper like office and writing and copy paper, and also newspapers and magazines and flyers and circulars and anything printed, basically. We're talking about packaging like materials, single-use products that are sold or supplied to consumers of any material type that consumers often treat just like packaging anyway. And we're excluding certain materials that are typically excluded from these bills, like things that are collected and actually recycled through other EPR programs, and like dirty paper, like tissues and TP and stuff. So those are our covered materials. One thing that's really going to change with the onset of this legislation is once the law passes, it will create a statewide list of what is recyclable everywhere in Illinois. That is not a ceiling, it's a floor. So it's not going to prohibit communities from accepting more than what's on the list if they have locally the capacity and infrastructure and ability to do that. But it is going to mandate a bare minimum of what must be recyclable no matter where I am in Illinois. I shouldn't be confused going from one town to another about what's recyclable and what's not. There are things that should just be clearly recyclable everywhere. And once that list is published, there will be extensive stakeholder input on that list. Of course, it's probably going to be a whole long process to get that finalized and published. It will also be regularly updated. There's also the option for producers to collect items that are not on the list, like say, a plastic bag. Maybe plastic bags aren't on that list because not everybody, they don't really make sense in curbside and people don't really always want them in there, but maybe there's a way through retail drop off, like store drop off, to kind of collect those a different way. So there's still flexibility for producers to kind of fund and operate alternative programs for other things that aren't on the list. So we want more, not less, is the idea here. But we also want some standardization, and we want consumers to be less confused about what to do with all their materials. Walter already mentioned a lot of the really exciting convenience standards and accessibility provisions that are in the draft bill. Those aren't going to be changed, except maybe some like very minor details and population numbers and such. But the idea is, as Walter said, recyclables should be collected pretty much everywhere that they're generated in the state. So this is going to cover public spaces, schools, all single and multifamily residences. The idea is to make it as accessible to everyone as possible and as widespread as possible, to collect as much material as possible. And again, everything that's on that statewide list has to be collected. And there are some additional convenience standards for curbside collection, wherever there will be a population threshold. This number 1,500 that's on the slide is one thing that we've gotten some feedback on, what exactly is the right number. So the number may change, but the idea is there will be a population threshold. And if you have a population above that threshold, then there must be curbside recycling in that community. And if you are below that threshold, say you're very rural, then maybe it makes more sense to have a depot, so that will be fine. There still needs to be recycling access, so there must be at least a depot. But the add-on to that is there can't be any backsliding. So for any towns that might fall under that threshold, if they already have curbside, they have to keep the curbside. And the idea is that this is not meant to be onerous for municipalities, because the bill goes to the producers. So everybody gets curbside and you don't have to pay for it. And that is why this is a very exciting bill. So speaking of producers, who are they? Producers are, it's a little complicated. I don't want to spend too much time on this definition today, but it's basically a tiered definition. So imagine like this is a flow chart, and you kind of have to like follow your way through the flow chart to figure out who the producer is. For the most part, it's going to be consumer brands. If you're a consumer brand putting a thing on the market and your brand is on that bottle of shampoo, then you're paying for the bottle of shampoo. You're paying the fees. There are some specifics about whether the brands manufacture their own products or they have someone else manufacture, and that's kind of getting into the weeds. There is, though, I want to highlight an exception for retailer brands. So like if it's a store brand item, basically, then the producer would kind of shift upstream to be the manufacturer of that packaging to exempt retailers from being producers. Same thing for shipping packaging. And there are some folks that are just excluded. So like municipalities are never going to be a producer. So municipalities are not going to be charged as a producer for, like, say, printed flyers that you might be sending to your residents. There's also always some small business exemptions. This is really intended to get at big companies, not like small mom and pop shops. So we're not, they're just entirely exempt, under a certain revenue and material threshold. And that's very common in EPR. Now, some of the other key elements of the bill are governance. Everybody is always very concerned about, who has power in this system. It's a really important question. The committee spent lots and lots of time on this. So first and foremost, producers are going to have to form one or more producer responsibility organizations, or PROs. Those need to be registered nonprofit organizations. If there are multiple, they have to coordinate so that it's not confusing for everybody else. They may just only form one. IEPA will, of course, have oversight and enforcement authority, as they should with any EPR law. They will be reviewing and approving program plans that the PROs propose, and annual reports that the PROs have to submit on their progress, facilitating public engagement, of course, doing any enforcement that's necessary, all the typical IEPA roles. which are really critical. And then there will also be, as Walter mentioned, a multi-stakeholder advisory council appointed by the IEPA. And that's going to be a bunch of folks that I have on another slide. So you'll get to see that in a second. And their job is to provide guidance. It's not legally binding. They're not a regulatory entity, but it is formalized guidance from this multi-stakeholder group, both to the producers and to the state. So they have a really, really critical role. They're basically a third governing body, if you will, in this structure to provide input from really, really important people across the value chain. They will provide written recommendations on the program, review annual reports, all that jazz. And there will be some voting and non-voting members. So here's right now what that advisory council looked like. We did get some feedback on this, so there may be slight changes to this. And happy to take more feedback on the makeup of the advisory council. The idea is that, of course, individual people will be, again, appointed by IEPA, but the law will have some guidance on there must be 3 representatives of MRFs in the state. And so there will be some like blank lines for IEPA to fill out with names, essentially. So this is the idea: voting members over here, non-voting members over here. For example, there's always a liaison from the state agency with that advisory council, of course, so they can be in the loop. So, and I will share these slides after, so you don't have to be writing all this down. So how the money flows into this system is really important, obviously. The producers need to pay fees to their producer responsibility organization on all packaging, all covered materials, so packaging and printed paper and all that stuff on the covered materials slide, anything that they put on the market, anything that's with their brand or anything that they are the producer for, going through that flow chart, they have to pay. They have to pay into the system for that to cover so many costs that we're going to talk about, but really the cost of managing those materials at end of life, plus some other things. And the fees are for all covered materials, whether or not the items are recyclable or compostable or landfill bound or whatever they are, doesn't matter. If you make it and you sell it into the state, you're paying for that item. There are some flat fees for small producers. So if they don't quite meet the de minimis exemption, but they're maybe still kind of on the smaller end and we don't want to create tons of administrative burdens with them, they're just flat fees for those. That's another pretty standard element of EPR programs. And the fees are not, unless you're in that little category of flat fees, the fees are not, they're not just a lump sum that producers all pay. They are eco-modulated, which means they have environmental factors incentivized, incentives baked into the fee structure. So eco-modulated fees is just a fancy way to say environmental incentives, basically. And here you can see a list of factors that the PRO will need to factor into a fee structure. So the law isn't going to dictate you must pay 30 cents a ton for plastic. It's not going to get that prescriptive, but it is going to have this list in it and say, when you propose a fee structure to the state for approval, it better be incentivizing these things. So show us a fee structure that incentivizes these things, and then, we can't approve it unless it does, basically. So, that's things like improving reusability and recyclability. So this would in practice mean if I'm a producer and I put something on the market that is not recyclable or reusable or compostable, I'm probably paying some more money for that. I'm getting a malice fee, or I'm getting a little slap on the wrist for doing that. It would be financially prudent for me to switch to reusable or recyclable packaging because that'll cost me less in this system. That's the basic idea. Now, what is all that money covering? It's covering a lot. So this is just an initial list of what the money's covering, and then I have a few additional slides on where the money goes. Basically, as I said, producers pay these fees with all these incentives baked into them. They pay them into the PRO, that producer responsibility nonprofit. And then the PRO has to turn around and spend that money. So they're first going to spend it on a statewide needs assessment. This will get baseline data on reuse, recycling, composting, and important, information that is needed statewide to kind of get the lay of the land. What is the situation right now? Where are there infrastructure gaps? Where are there funding gaps? Where is more education funding needed? Anything covered by the program is in the needs assessment. So they're going to do that first. That's then going to help them, inform their program plan, which includes the PRO covering recycling system costs. So this is the big win, right? Of course, for municipalities, if you currently run a recycling program and you want to keep doing that, then you would be reimbursed for all of your related recycling costs, from collection all the way through disposing of contamination and getting it to an end market. Anything that you do and is related to recycling, you get your costs covered. So the plan has to show how the PRO is going to distribute, take your receipts basically and distribute reimbursements. There may be incentives baked into a reimbursement rate that help ensure some efficiencies. So producers are always really anxious that municipalities are going to see a blank check and just get like gold-plated garbage trucks. That's their favorite. I had a penny for every time I heard about gold-plated garbage trucks. We know those don't exist, so we know you're already being reasonable, but basically they'll write a formula for, like, if your cost was this $1 million a year, we'll plug it into our formula and make sure it's all reasonable, and you'll probably get 96 to 98% of those costs reimbursed in practice. So that's the general idea. Sometimes it will be 100. Now, where there are no government programs in place, if it's like a subscription community, which we know happens across the state, then the PRO is going to have to step in and directly fund service providers so that recycling services are paid for everywhere in Illinois, no matter if a municipality, say, is too small to start a recycling program right now and doesn't have one. So that's fine. If it's a depot, it's still covered. Basically, any recycling collection costs are covered. The PRO is also going to have to make direct infrastructure investments. So based on that needs assessment, they may find we really need more infrastructure for glass processing in Southern Illinois. And so we're going to invest in this cool sorting machine that helps do that, or whatever it is, right? So it's meant to be additive. It's meant to be in addition to all the great existing infrastructure. It's just, if there are needs, the PRO needs to fund and address those needs based on the needs assessment. They also need to pay for investing in end markets for materials, because it doesn't really count as recycling unless it's actually recycled. So we need to see real robust end markets regionally. And of course, they cover the administrative costs for the IPA, because this shouldn't be costing taxpayers more money. So that's just the start of what the PRO covers, but I want to really hone in on protecting existing infrastructure. That's very important, of course, in this program. That's why we went with this reimbursement model for any municipalities that are currently running a program, so that you've already made millions of dollars of investments into infrastructure much of the time, and that's not going to be replaced. It is only going to be supported and enhanced. So that's the idea. So there will be many provisions in the bill to make sure that any existing infrastructure must be used, and if the needs assessment shows it needs to be improved, then the PRO covers those costs, but you still retain authority to run those facilities and systems. Also, it's not going to interfere with any of your existing contracts with haulers. If you have those, that's kind of why the reimbursement model makes a lot of sense. Because if you already have a contract and you're 2 years in and you got 2 more years left or something like that, that's fine. You're just now getting your costs paid for by the PRO instead of having to pay yourself. So it doesn't interfere with the terms of your contract in any way. And you also retain the right not to do a contract next time. It's kind of up to you. You still kind of have all your same options. The other thing the PRO has to pay for is outreach and education requirements. Very, very important. And there's a nifty little thing in the bill where the PRO will, first they will provide resources, customizable resources that municipalities can use, take advantage of, especially once there's a statewide list that could really help with harmonization across the state, just having the same kind of type of flyer out there for residents or signage or whatever it may be. The PRO is also going to have to set aside just a chunk of funding that local counties and joint action agencies will be eligible to receive and then distribute. So that I'm not going to get into the whole formula, but we can do that in the Q&A if you want. But basically, it's population based. They set aside a pot of education funding. Counties and joint action agencies can collect that funding and also put it toward education. So meant to, have the PRO be contributing statewide to education and giving you customizable resources, but also allowing for that local flexibility and, the continued education work that many of your communities are already doing on recycling. And they're also going to do direct outreach statewide. As I said, they're going to have a website. They might do like a billboard campaign or who knows, radio ads. So the PRO advantage is that they'll be a statewide entity, so they'll be able to kind of easily contribute money to education statewide. There are a couple other provisions I want to mention in the bill, and then I will stop so we have time for Q&A. There is a plastics recycling technologies study currently written into the draft bill that the IEPA will conduct, and the PRO will pay for that cost to do that study. And it'll basically, it's really about chemical recycling. I'm using that in quotes because it's not a great term, but it's about which technologies should be allowed basically under the law to count as recycling for mostly for plastics, but for other materials. So because there wasn't real clarity on how to deal with that out of the gate, basically we came up with this study on the committee. Folks were feeling like this was the right move to do a study, and then the study will inform how the PRO is able to make investments into certain technologies or what can count as recycling. So that study right now has a date of July 1, 2025, but dates subject to change upon bill revision, but it will fit into the timeline of the overall program. Then there are a couple of special programs where the PRO is mandated to set aside funding for both waste prevention and reuse, and also composting infrastructure and education. This is to acknowledge that reusable packaging and compostable packaging are also kind of paying into this system, but it's not going to fund like curbside composting statewide all of a sudden. So there needs to be some way that the system addresses and these other types of packaging. And waste prevention, of course, is just to make sure that some money goes to the ultimate goal of waste prevention, which is of course higher on the waste hierarchy than any of this other stuff, right? So we want to make sure waste reduction is top of mind, so the PRO can distribute that money in many different ways. Could be grants, loans, direct funding, and there are some requirements for how much of their total program budget must be directed to these things. These are another couple of items we got a lot of feedback on. So the committee is going to decide whether to change some of the details of this, maybe the thresholds, or whether it makes sense to keep it in this way. But it's based on Oregon's new packaging EPR law and a couple of other pieces of relevant legislation. So didn't come out of thin air. And the idea is just to make sure that, again, so that there's some funding dedicated to these other things as well. It's not just recycling. Walter mentioned there are strong performance standards. There are going to be some recycling targets in statute that must be met that are pretty doable with an EPR system in place. And then the stewardship plan, that program plan that the PRO submits for approval, is going to also be mandated to include a lot more targets that then the PRO has to meet for recovery, recycling, post-consumer recycled content. We've gotten some feedback that folks would like to see a PCR content requirement in the statute, so that's under consideration. And then they're going to have to break down their targets by material type, like plastic, metal, glass, etc. So it's going to be a lot more specific than the numbers that end up in statute. And those are enforceable targets as well. And they need to be updated every 5 years per the pace of the program. There is also currently a section in the draft bill that would ban PFAS and other problematic material, create a list of other problematic materials, but we have received a lot of feedback recommending that this be removed. So that's also under discussion right now. The last thing I just want to mention is there are some really important definitions that we get asked about a lot. Recycling is not going to be allowed to include landfill disposal, beneficial landfill use, incineration, energy recovery, or conversion to a fuel. And there are very specific definitions of reuse as well, meaning you can't be counted as reusable unless you are designed to be refilled and reused repeatedly for your original intended purpose. Got to be non-toxic and recyclable, and there needs to be an average annual return rate of 80%. That threshold may change, but the idea is that the item must be part of an actual producer run and funded reuse and refill program. So it can't just be like something that they claim could theoretically be reused, like a tomato sauce jar, you know, by the consumer. It has to be a real reuse refill program. So next steps are, we are still accepting feedback, but I mentioned we're kind of winding down and looking toward updating the bill language based on the extensive feedback we received so far over the summer. The core team is going to reconvene this afternoon, in fact, to debrief all that feedback so far and begin updating the draft bill, looking for sponsors, looking toward 2023 introduction. We'll be reconvening the committee a couple times to finalize the bill, but that's where we're at in the process. My contact info and Walter's contact info is here, and you'll have that in the slides afterward. And I will stop there for questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sydney. This is Edith. Mayor Burns had to step away, so I'll manage the questions here. Mayor Reinbold, you have a hand up?
Yes, thanks, Edith. Sydney, great presentation. Question on the legislation. Have you identified a sponsor for the bill yet?
Great question. I can start on this, and then Walter will probably want to jump in as well. We have had strong interest from Representative Avalar and her staff who participated in our committee. However, there are ongoing discussions to look for additional sponsors and perhaps a different prime sponsor. So it's not set in stone yet, but that is definitely under discussion. And Walter, I don't know if you want to add any specific names.
What was the question again? I'm sorry.
Do we have a sponsor? And I was just saying, you know, Rev Avalar participated, and we're looking at a few others as well.
Yeah, we are kicking around different names, obviously with the city of Chicago being a big proponent. Chris Sauvé's on the call. They spend about $30 million a year out of their general fund, which we could shift it to the producers under this bill. So we might be looking to the city. We also would likely look downstate, because the downstate impact of this bill is significant as far as access to recycling. I did see a question on PFAS in the chat, and
yeah,
one of the reasons why we might take that out is it's even the environmental community might agree that maybe that's a standalone bill. And if we put too many things on our bill, we complicate it, and perfect is the enemy of good, right? So this bill's main intent is not PFAS, it's to increase access to recycling and shift that cost to where it needs to be so we get the right kind of packaging in the marketplace.
Great, thank you.
And Walter and Sydney, we have a question from Rich Babica. And Rich, if you're still there, do you want to unmute yourself and ask that? Otherwise, I'll ask on your behalf. Looks like you're still here. Yeah, so if you would.
Edith, yeah, my question is related to most agencies, especially in this, run a free curbside recycling collection as part of our refuse contract. And the salvage value of the recycling is what offsets the cost for the recycling program. And my question then is, are those agencies going to be reimbursed? Because in essence, we're not paying for a recycling program. Or how is our contractor going to be reimbursed? Because their costs are being offset through the salvage value, which is a highly volatile market in and of itself.
Yeah, I saw this in the chat, Rich, and I've done over 200 contract procurements in Lake County. I don't have a single one where we have free recycling. To run the truck up and down the street by itself is $5 to $7 a household a month. So I'm not aware of this scenario. Some towns do get share of the revenue, I know some of the towns where we're getting $5 to $10 a ton, depending on what the revenue for the recyclables were. We're not seeing those contracts anymore. The tipping fee at the MRFs, or the material recovery facilities in the Chicagoland market, especially when the markets weren't very good, were $80 to $85 a ton is what a hauler would pay to take his truckload or her truckload to their recycling plant. That will vary based on markets, but there is no payment to the haulers that I'm aware of right now, unless you own a MRF and then you're running that as a business profit center. So I'm not aware of this scenario. Like I said, Waukegan, they pay out of their general fund for their 19,000 households to recycle. It's $87,000 a month for the city. They pay that bill. That cost would get shifted under this legislation. So not trying to be argumentative. I'm just not understanding that scenario. I've never seen it.
Well,
Yeah,
Walter,
that-
maybe you and I can have a conversation offline afterwards, and I'd love to meet with you. But in managing the City of Geneva's collection program, I can tell you it's far more common, especially in Kane and DuPage County, that there is not a cost to the local agency for those recycling collections.
Well, typically
Many
they'll
agencies run a pay-as-you-go program through sticker sales. So either they're buried into the indirect costs of those sticker sales, or just through the pure salvage value. And I'd love to have a conversation with you.
Yeah, I'm aware of those programs. So yeah, we should do that, Rich. I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, and I'll just say, I mean, ultimately, it's a net cost reimbursement. So the revenue is taken into consideration and you're not getting paid twice for recycling. So, because producers would never agree to that. So that, you know, in the unicorn scenario that I've never personally encountered, where you're actually getting a net revenue from recycling or breaking even, then there just wouldn't be anything to reimburse. But as Walter said, I think it is typically what we see is there's a net expense. And it may just come down to, it just comes down to how you're doing the math and what covered costs you're looking at. But there is an extensive amount of cost coverage in this bill. So I think most municipalities will be getting something back.
There's a question in the chat about other states. There are 4 other states now, Maine, Oregon, California, and Colorado have all passed it. Half the provinces in Canada, I believe, have this, and Europe. So there's a lot of experience. It sounds complicated. How do you figure out what the fee is for this type of packaging versus that type of packaging? Well, it's all kind of been figured out. You want to use complicated multi-layered plastic packaging for your container, you're going to pay more per ton to put that on the marketplace than you would if you used single, more easily recyclable plastic, right? So it's all kind of cooked into this scenario here.
Yeah, and not just figured out, but like for decades, these programs have been running for Europe for over 30 years. They've been running in Canadian provinces for 15, 20 plus years. There is extensive experience. So we are just very much lagging behind in the US in terms of packaging EPR. That being said, there's also 130 other EPR laws, including in Illinois on other products in the US. So, but with all that experience combined, I have 100% confidence this can be worked out in Illinois.
Key question, what can you guys do to help? And I meant to hit on that in my opening remarks. Local government, like you listen to the Colorado story, local government, most municipal and county, was absolutely essential. We do not get this legislation without local government support, both those that have programs and those that don't. So you guys who are mayors and elected officials, and even, you know, people that are involved in their community, you know, your legislators. So we absolutely need you to talk to them. It's a complicated topic in one sense, but it's not in another. It will change recycling in Illinois so that everybody, we didn't go to the commercial sector. It complicates the bill a little bit. Maybe that's a long-term thing, but we absolutely need local government support, the councils of government. We hope to have a meeting with IML here shortly. We've met with one of the county associations. This is a game changer. And those that are paying out of their general fund through property tax, like Chicago and Waukegan and a lot of other municipalities that do that, that money's coming out of a cost of your budget. So that would be a significant benefit. And there were some questions in the chat about cost. Obviously, that's something we're going to hear in Springfield. We're in the middle of inflation. What are you doing here? This is going to raise costs. We've got studies in Canada where provinces with and without, there's hardly any discernible difference. There's fractions of a penny. Can we argue that the consumer won't ultimately pay? Probably not. But the Columbia study I put in the chat, I think came out to about $4 a household a month. You're paying double that for your curbside now, potentially. And to me, I'd rather have that cost passed on to me, knowing that the brand owner has to make a better decision about the packaging they're using. So I'm not so confused, and I'll be a better recycler and will help reduce the greenhouse gases that we started talking this whole meeting about. So.
Yeah, I would love to add on to this if I can. I think that there's a lot you can do. Municipalities have the most important role in passing this legislation of any other group in the state. It will not pass without your support. You are the voice of this problem, right? And so like, if you're not asking for this funding, why is anybody going to give it to you, right? So that's kind of what it comes down to in the legislature. You need to be testifying in support of this bill. You need a joint letter, perhaps, expressing your support. You need to be talking to your representatives and senators. You need to be doing everything that you can really to call for support for this bill. We are going to have fact sheets and all kinds of great things that you can use. So we're not asking you to do it alone, but I do think it's really, really important. It's in fact necessary that that you support this legislation if you want it to pass. In every other state in the US where packaging EPR legislation has passed, and it's all in the last 2 years where this momentum has just like really picked up. And we've had 4 laws passed in the last 2 years. That's all because municipalities were clamoring for this funding and for this support. It's also just a matter of like fundamental fairness. You don't have any control right now over what materials are put onto the market, and you are expected to deal with all of them at their end of life. That disconnect is never going to work. So if we want to see a circular economy, the only way to do it is get producers involved. If they're not plugged in, we are not going to get there because that link is missing. So I think that messaging is so powerful, but like it has to come from you, not me. So that's the idea. And on the consumer cost issue, yeah, I'm extremely confident that this will not raise consumer costs. As Walter said, there are many studies on this issue. That $4 a month figure is a prediction, and it's based on the assumption that it's like even if EPR were to pass on all of the costs and somehow double the cost of consumer goods, it would still only come out to $4. But the only study I've seen that looks at real life actual data of what's happening in real actual EPR programs has found no increase in cost whatsoever. So I wouldn't be advocating for this policy if I thought it would have a negative impact on consumers, because I'm a consumer and I don't want to deal with that. But it isn't going to happen. And luckily we have decades of experience to show that. So that's a plus. But I'll get off my soapbox.
Kim Stone has got her hand up. Hi, Kim.
I do. Hi, I've got a 2-part question, one part for you, one part for Edith. Edith, will you keep this group informed about the progress of this legislation?
I will, and I was going to ask you or someone to say, because you're kind of prepping me for this, prepping me to ask Walter and Sydney and Marta and Joy and everybody on the call to for help. What do you need? If you want to put that in the chat, what do municipalities need to track this and to support it? So that kind of sets up your question a little bit, Marta, and then I'll, excuse me, Kim, and go ahead and ask your question. Let's see if I'm on track.
We need to know, I think, who is going to sponsor it, on what the bill number is, and then we need to communicate with our legislators to get co-sponsors on board. And we probably also, Walter, need like a sample resolution that we can pass through some of our city councils supporting this legislation. I think that's an easy way for cities to make their voices heard by their elected officials, is to just pass a resolution, and then that goes to the elected officials at the state level.
I like that idea. so that we can work on that. I think, like Sydney said, we're going to come up with some fact sheets, and like Lake County's already got this on their legislative agenda. So I've been working at the local angle. I know Chris in Chicago has been working it, and Christina, and so, and the different councils of government, which Edith, kind of is the umbrella group. We definitely need to get into the Northwest Municipal Conference, South Suburban Mayors, Lake County, Will County. We got to get to the COGS, and we've got to get this on the radar. It's, as you know, in Springfield, it's hard to get bandwidth, but this is a big one.
Well, they're putting together their agendas for the next legislative session, and we've provided input from Highland Park. And usually they say no to all the environmental input that I suggest. But if it impacts anything in terms of the pocketbook or finances of municipalities, the COGS may get involved. And then I also hopefully I'm speaking for both Beth Drucker and I, we can certainly provide some information to Go Green groups, and I'll talk to you later about that, Walter, so that they can, I don't want to use the word lobby, but advocate for this as well.
Yeah, I like the idea of the resolutions, and then, sit down meetings with everybody in the Lake County delegation and getting them up to speed, Republicans and Dems. And I hope others can do the same. This network that Metro Mayors has is essential to us. That's why we spend a lot of time with your group, Edith.
Thank you for that.
You're valuable.
So if there's anything else the municipalities need from me, please put that in the chat or just go ahead and speak up now. And I'll work closely to make sure that we're sharing information here. Looks like we need fact sheets. We need to have some financial impacts for municipalities. Rich and anybody else, did we get all your questions answered about hauling contracts, or does that still need to be resolved?
I think Walter and I are just going to follow up offline.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's another question, and then we can work with the COGS to relay this opportunity, and then see, kind of to Kim's suggestion, if the COGS would be interested in incorporating this as they put together their legislative agendas for the year.
Well, great. This is very helpful. Getting the word out about this bill is what we're trying to do. And we'll definitely want to keep everybody in the loop, and we'll work closely with you, Kim, here in Lake County as well. So.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. And I just have to really praise the product stewardship group for including the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus in the development of this legislation. It's really been exciting to be a part of the conversation, and then to have it get to this point where now it's a really good looking bill that we seem to like. By the way, if you're, it sounds from the discussion like we're mostly in favor of it, but please, voice concerns if you have it. Otherwise, I'll make some presumptions about the municipalities feeling pretty good about this bill and helping to move it forward. So with that, if there are any other questions, again, please add them to the chat, but let's wrap up and go to kind of next meetings. If you've been on the Environment Committee for a while, you've noticed that we used to do meetings 10 times a year or thereabouts, and Cheryl and I haven't taken a break yet. We've been having one or two every month, and we thought we were going to take October off, but it actually, there's always stuff to do. There's just so much momentum. We will have an energy subcommittee meeting on October 12th. And there are two topics there that we want your opinion on. And this is changing. One is that we are proposing to create an energy academy, name yet to be determined, but we have our consultant, Mark Pruitt, and others from the energy industry who are willing to help train municipal staff and sustainability commissioners. I'm saying it really to carry the ball forward on energy policy so that you're a little bit more independent, and that we don't have to try to pretend that we have expertise in energy, because there's just a lot to it. So that's an empowering energy academy that we're proposing to be a free class, almost a graduate level class that we will be doing with support of the Illinois Science and Energy and Innovation Fund. that has been supporting our Cheryl and my work for about 3 years now, and that organization sunsets this June. So we want to make sure that there's, the energy advocacy and policy work continues in the absence of that funding. So that's topic number one. Second one has to do with implementation of CEJA related to low energy efficiency programs and new structuring for collaborating with contractors and potentially municipalities. We want your opinion there. That's October 12th. Cheryl put that in the chat. The one thing about, if you're wondering, Energy Subcommittee was a bit of a spinoff from the Environment Committee. Anyone is welcome to join that. It was just a focus group on energy policy, but everybody will be invited to join that. And please let us know if you have a particular interest in being specifically appointed to that Energy Subcommittee. Another meeting we're having, this is part of our really exciting ongoing work with Metropolitan Planning Council and Active Transportation Alliance, part of an event series. Last one on taking climate action by prioritizing walking, biking, and transit. You saw that from Jared's presentation on greenhouse gas emissions. This is an area we really need to work on. So October 13th at noon, we're having a virtual planning working on ADA transition planning to make sidewalks and public transportation and active transportation more accessible to everyone. So those are 2 events in October, and we are planning a first in-person Environment Committee meeting for November. This was a topic that was suggested to us by the Environment Committee. I think it's actually Kim Stone's idea. We want to hear from the about the future of the natural gas industry, and the Gas Technology Institute in Des Plaines will be hosting us for a tour and meeting at that facility. It's a cool place if you've never been. November 15th. And I think that is everything. Cheryl or anyone else, did I forget anything? Anybody else want to add? Thank you, Glenn. In-person meeting finally. Yes, the meetings have been going so well with virtual. The attendance is really high. It's kind of hard to get back to traveling around.
What time on November 15th is that meeting?
Should be 10 to 11:30, although we are still planning that, but that's maybe 10 to noon, depending on the tour. It's been a while since we've done it, but they used to be 10 to noon, and we switched to 10 to 11:30 for the online format.
I feel like we went there before once.
We did, way back before EVs were hot. We went there looking at alternate fuels, and we looked at the CNG charging station. So yeah, it's been a while since we've been there. But we'll have the utilities present, gas utilities present. Should be a good conversation.
What's the name of the place, Edith? I'm sorry.
It's the Gas Technology Institute. And they are, it's a research-based organization that works with natural gas. And we'll send out all the information on that.
I hope we're going to have somebody on the other side of the situation talking about why we shouldn't be expanding gas.
Okay.
If not, you'll hear from me at that meeting.
Okay, I hope so. We're actually encouraged with what the utilities are telling us. Thank you for Cheryl that. And we may do a hybrid. We'll talk to our host. We actually have a planning meeting this week. So join us for those other meetings. Go ahead and before you hop off, drop something in the chat, how you feel about the Energy Subcommittee. But again, everybody will be invited to be a part of that discussion. And welcome to all the new members of the Environment Committee. Really nice to see. Looks like there's more staff being added for municipal sustainability staff. So if we haven't welcomed you individually, thank you all for being here. And with that, we'll wrap. We will see you on those meetings in October and certainly hope to see you in November. Thanks for all your good work. We'll be in touch about the EPR. And then we will also share information on the greenhouse gas emissions report when CMAP is releasing that. Thank you.